Good morning. How is everybody doing? It's good to see you. Hope that you are doing well and ready for a last full week of your first semester of law school. Here we go into that. So I just wanted to just mention a couple of quick things. First, I am pulling together a series of conveyances, just practice that I'll hopefully have them posted before class on Wednesday, but the goal will be to make those available to you guys to work on, and then Monday, a week from today, we'll set aside just to work through practice conveyances again. Excuse me. And so look for that. I'm also thinking that this afternoon, in a non-conveyance, just kind of take a slight break. I know that y'all have a lot of Zooms on Mondays already, but I was thinking at 2, if y'all remember at the beginning of the semester, I said that there was a requirement for the course that you meet with me in small groups at some point. Y'all may not remember this, but it was something that I did say at the beginning, or that was there in the syllabus. Kind of like I said, there would be 3 quizzes, and just pretend all that didn't happen. But the truth is, without being in person, my goal with that was not the quizzes, but with the meetings, was to set aside time to just catch up and get to know you guys. And I recognize that it's towards the end of the semester, and I've gotten to know quite a few of you, either in office hours or in your participant class or emails, etc. But I wanted to provide a space, so I'm calling it a semi-happy hour at 2 o'clock today. I'll send an email, and I'll just open the Zoom room, this same one, just to come hang out. And if I'm the only one in there, then I'll just be a lonesome Zoomer by myself, and that'll be okay. But hopefully I won't be. There will not be any substantive discussion, so if you don't come, you won't miss anything from property class. So it is just a sort of informal, let's hang out and take a break from the first semester here at the end. So 2 o'clock for you guys, and just come to this same regular old link. I'll send an email so that you guys don't forget, because I really, yeah. Okay, so are there administrative questions? I know we had the talk about the exam format. Hopefully y'all are comfortable with where everything is going on that front. Anything that we need to elevate here?
Yeah, when we get the exam 4 links or what have you, I know you and the other professors were mentioning different, like having the ability to have different tabs open at the same time. Would you allow us to do that, or would you say just print out what we need and have those so we can just, do the exam on?
You're really kind of outside of what I know. In terms of setting up the exam, my preference is going to always be allow as much flexibility for y'all as possible. So assuming that there is a setting that allows multiple tabs to be open, and I think that there is, then you'll have the ability to use your computer in its entirety. And I assume that exam 4 will just be one window among however many, whatever. I don't know how the whole thing works, but I assume that you'll be able to use your computer fully, and that printing, which I would do if I were taking the exam, but I recognize that y'all might work differently than I do. I don't think printing would change that. I think that If you print it, then you'll have it printed, but you also might have it on your screen as well.
Thank you.
That's how I understand it. I've never taken an exam this way, so yeah, I just don't speak from experience. Anything else? Okay, so on Wednesday, we went through Delfino. We got this discussion of partition done, and I think that, and I'm hopeful that y'all can see how partition fits into the overall structure of concurrent estates, being that if things aren't going well, either party can unilaterally partition the property at any point, and that will end the concurrent estates. And since either party, and when I say either, really it could be property held by 15 different tenants in common or joint tenants. And if that's the case, then any of the 15 can trigger a partition for the whole of the property, okay? And so because that lurks as a possibility, it should encourage some cooperation among co-tenants during co-tenancy. If they want to maintain the right to joint full enjoyment, then they need to have some sort of agreement or cooperation, or at least not wanting to sue each other to the extent that they would trigger a partition that has to exist during the co-tenancy. Otherwise, they're at risk of unilaterally losing the right to joint full enjoyment, right? So, so that's how partition fits in. Of course, it's not always possible to do a partition perfectly. We talked on Wednesday about how a partition in kind is often more difficult because of the non-uniformity of land, okay? Because one portion of the property might be more valuable than another portion of the property, or might have different physical characteristics than another portion of the property. And so we have, that's reality. And so one thing I want to point out, well, let me back up. Another reality is that sometimes one joint tenant or tenant in common, one co-tenant, does more to improve the property than another. So if we are joint tenants, there's two joint tenants, and one of them builds a really valuable house on the property. Well, they've invested some of their own money. The property, at least in theory, is jointly accessible to every co-tenant, but it seems to be the case that the co-tenant who put in the labor and made the investment to create the house ought to get some sort of extra value when it comes to splitting at a partition, okay? And so even where you sell the property and split the money, sometimes there's a possibility that there is this inequitable division, right? Even though it was a 70-30 split percentage-wise in ownership, maybe because one of the parties invested so much, they ought to get more than what their share, or less than what their share is, for example. And so I want to introduce just briefly, and we're going to talk about it again at the end of the two cases that we have left, this concept called OLT. Okay, it is the way in which a court, upon partition, can account for this potential inequitable division. Okay, so for example, imagine a parcel of property that is really valuable on the western half, but really just sort of normal value on the eastern half. Okay, so we're making it somewhat simple, half and half, and it's split 4 ways, right? So we have 4 tenants in common for that. And so we could maybe draw lines in such a way that they each get part of the western half and part of the eastern half, right? So if we draw like lines that way, then they would each get a part. But it's possible, no matter how we draw the lines, that the value of the property is not going to be split perfectly 4 ways, right? So let's say that co-tenant A gets 25 property that's actually valued at about 25% of the overall property. Co-tenant B gets the same. But then for the other two, they make it so that in a partition, co-tenant C gets more than what they ought to, right? They get, let's say, 35% of the value of the property, and co-tenant D gets 15% of the value of the property. So everybody following that? So we have 4 equal shares, but when they physically divide the property, they don't actually get 4 equal shares. Is that making sense? That's the problem. Okay. What OLT is the way in which you account for that. So in this example, A and B are kind of out. They've got exactly a share that reflects what their interests were upon partition, but C and D don't, right? C has 35%, D has 15%. So what OLT will do is require, in order to make it reflective of the interests that they had in co-tenancy, O will take D in some way, usually with money, okay? And so C will have to make some sort of payment to D to account for that gap, right? That D should have gotten 25% of the value, 15, and so OLT will sort of bring them up to 25. Yeah, you guys are all breaking up for me also. I'm seeing that. So let's go video drop. And hopefully that helps. Gosh, it's so terrible when we drop the video. When I'm looking at you guys, I'm sure you see basically the same thing, basically the same thing that I see. But when the videos are on, I can see y'all moving and your faces and nodding and everything. And then when the videos go off, it's just your names, and it's really disorienting. But it's better that you're able to hear me. So I'm just going to go back over OLT, and I'm going to ask you guys to ask for clarification to the extent necessary. So hopefully you got the setup that there were 4 co-tenants, and 2 of them got 25%, but the other 2 didn't get in the partition shares that were reflective of 25%. And so what will happen in order to sort of account for that differential, that co-tenant C got 35% and co-tenant D got 15%, but they really should have both gotten 25. In order to fix that, a court will order co-tenant C, who got too much, to compensate too much land or too valuable of land, to compensate co-tenant D, who got too little. That compensation is called OLT. Okay, that compensation is called OLT, and it is meant to account for the reality that it's virtually impossible to divide the land precisely to reflect the pre-existing interest that the parties had in co-tenancy. Okay, so that's what OLT does, and I just mention it because in addition to the discretion that courts have in ordering partitions, right? We talked about that in the Delfino context. They also have the discretion where a partition in kind occurs to order OLT. It can also happen with a partition by sale, but that's a little different. So we'll hold off on that until after we've talked about Schwarzball. Okay, so hopefully y'all got OLT, but I'm going to pause here and see if anyone needs anything repeated. I know that I was going in and out there.
Yes, you started saying that OLT requires something, and then you cut out.
I think maybe what I was saying is that OLT requires a co-tenant who gets more than what they ought to have gotten to compensate co-tenants who got less than what they ought to have gotten. Okay, And when I say ought to have gotten, what I'm talking about is based on the interests that they had in the property when it was in co-tenancy. So in that example that we were using, the co-tenant C should have had a 25% interest, but got 35% value of the property upon partition. So they got more than what they ought to have gotten. So they were required by OLT to compensate the co-tenants who got less. Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. Other clarifications, other questions? Yeah, Alana?
I'm just a little murky about procedurally how this occurs. So is it, you can ask.
Hold on, I can't hear you. I can hear you, but I can't hear you. I'm gonna turn up my volume.
Okay.
Go, try again.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, I guess.
Okay. I just was saying that I'm a little confused procedurally when this occurs. It only happens after the land has already been divided up, and then you ask the court to come in because you think that it's been divided unfairly.
No, it will happen in the context of a partition proceeding. Good question.
Okay. Okay.
So yeah, so someone will move for partition, and just like in Delfino, right? You can't stop a partition from happening if you're a co-tenant, but you can participate in the litigation just like any other litigation. And so if you're a party to the litigation and you see that let's say you wanted it to be a partition by sale, but now it's going to be a partition in kind. This is in fact kind of what happened in Delfino. And you don't like the way in which the property is being divided, you might ask the court or make a motion that the court include OLT in the partition judgment in order to account for that. So that is where it would happen. And note that none of this happens like in secret, right? This is all part of a proceeding in which all of the parties present should be aware of what's going on. So it's not like the court takes in all the information, the judge takes in all the information, and then goes off in secret and comes back with a fully baked partition. Most likely the parties are participating in that by petitioning the judge. There might be some sort of conference or even hearing in which the judge is there and asking questions of the parties in terms of to get the details straight for the partition. Anything else on partition? We good? Okay, so let's move forward. So I mentioned that partition is really important because its threat should force cooperation among co-tenants. But it is hard to maintain cooperation sometimes with co-tenants, especially because the physical reality is that joint full enjoyment, while a nice legal concept, isn't really possible, right? If I want to do one thing on property and that's going to preclude you from doing, my co-tenant from doing the thing that she wants to do on the property, then we're going to have some sort of conflict. So most property that's held in co-tenancy is subject to some sort of, if not formal, then at least informal agreement among the co-tenants as to how it's going to be used or how they're going to manage their relationship. So that's your best case scenario. But very few such agreements can account for every single possible conflict that might exist between co-tenants. And so we have default rules that kick in to sort of account for what happens when parties disagree or what happens when parties come into conflict about what to do with their property held in tenancy. And that is what Spiller and also Schwartzbaugh, the two cases, are about. So let's talk first about the Spiller case. And I just want to sort of use this as an opportunity to work through what happens when parties don't exactly agree on what to do with with this property and what their options are, what they have to do in order to sort of exercise those options. Okay, so let's start with Dalton here. If you could just give a little bit of the background of what's going on in this Spiller case, so that we can all sort of follow along.
Yes, sir. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So in this case, Spiller and Macrith were tenants in common for a building in, I believe, Tuscaloosa, Alabama. And then they had a company, AutoRite, that was leasing the building. And when they vacated, Spiller entered and began using the structure as a warehouse. When Macrith found out, she wrote.
Pause. Let's pause for just a second. So when AutoRite was in there, what do you think was happening? AutoRite was doing what?
They were leasing the building and using it.
And with regard to Spiller and Macrith, do you think they were giving Spiller and Macrith anything?
They were paying rent.
Right, they're paying rent. And do you think Spiller and Macrith, what were they doing with the money?
They're splitting it evenly.
Splitting it. Okay, so Spiller and Macrith were getting a portion of the rent that AutoRite was paying, and in the beginning. And then AutoRite's lease comes up, they don't renew, and they move out. And then you said Spiller starts moving stuff into this space, right?
Yes.
Okay. And so what's Macrith do?
So when Macrith finds out, she writes a letter demanding that Spiller either vacate half of the building or pay half of the rental value. And then Spiller did neither, so she brought a suit against him.
Great. So from Macrith's perspective, why do they want Spiller to pay the rent?
Because if he's using the full building, then she's getting no money out of it.
And if they were renting it to AutoRite, was Macrith getting money out of it?
Yeah, she was getting half of the rent.
Right. And so from her perspective, does it make any difference whether it's AutoRite or Spiller that's using the place?
No, as long as she gets the rent money.
Right. So she's not here for anything other than, the value of her ownership, right? That she owns this, at least a percentage ownership of it, and she wants the rental value for it. So I'm just going to ask you a really basic question, Dalton. Do individuals have to pay themselves rent to use their own property if we're not in the concurrent estates context? Like, do I pay myself rent to stay at my house?
No.
No. Why?
Because you own it.
Because I own it, and so I have the right to use it, and I have the right to do what I want with it. And I could choose to pay myself. That would be a little bizarre, but I could. So can you translate that principle to the concurrent estates context?
I guess, like in relation to like this situation, or just in general?
Let's start with in general.
I guess if Spiller had just fee simple over the entire building, he wouldn't have to pay himself because he owned it outright. But since he was in a joint tenancy with Macrith, he didn't have complete ownership. He only owned half of it. So if he were to use the entire thing, he would be using more than what his share was.
But what is is it the case that we can point to certain floors of the warehouse or certain square footage of the warehouse and say, okay, that's Spiller's portion and that's Macrith's portion? Is that how concurrent estates work?
I'm sorry, you broke up a little bit. Could you repeat that?
Sure. is there a place in the warehouse where we can say, okay, this portion, this floor, or this square footage, that belongs to Spiller, and this other square footage or this other floor belongs to Macrith? My question is that how concurrent estates work?
No.
No. So what does Spiller could go wherever he wanted on the property, right?
Yes.
So why should he have to pay rent to do more than I have to pay myself rent to live in my own house?
So basically, the reason that Macrith says that he has to pay rent is he was, instead of like you said, there's not really a way to like divide it evenly, but in any case, he was using the entire warehouse to the point where she couldn't even use her half of the warehouse if she wanted to rent it out to somebody because he was using the entire thing.
And so therefore, her argument is,
Well, her argument was that I think the word was like he was ousting her.
yeah. Well, hold off on that. Her argument was, you're using it so much that what?
That you should pay for it.
That you should pay me rent, right? Yeah, sure, you have the right to full enjoyment, but your right to full enjoyment is on some level precluding me from rent. Dalton, you said it. I think it's an important point. Precluding me from renting my portion to someone else, which is what maybe she wanted to do. Okay, you're precluding me from doing that. Therefore, you should just pay me rent as though you're paying rent. William Smiley, what do you think about that? Do you think that this is a good argument by Macrith?
I think it's a decent argument, but I do think that if you are co-tenants, you have some right to enjoy part of it, and that Spiller shouldn't be able to use the whole preclude Macrith from using the whole warehouse.
Even though that's fully within Spiller's rights.
Yeah, I guess I guess you just have to determine where one's rights start or stop and the other one's begin. So there's got to be some sort of remedy that they can come up with.
Well, so a couple of questions. What's one thing Macrith could do here? We know what this case is about. This case is about the rent, and we're going to get to that in a second. But what else could Macrith do if Macrith wants a portion of the warehouse? William, I'm looking at your box here.
I'm not sure what exactly the legal recourse would be to get half of it.
Well, think about our last case. Delfino and Violences couldn't agree on exactly what to do with the property. Delfino wanted to develop it. Violences wanted to keep at least a portion. And so they couldn't agree. And so what ended up being the recourse that Delfino took?
I don't remember specifically.
Brandon, what do you think?
I was going to say that she could either just go onto the land and exercise her right of enjoyment, or she could court and say that if you're going to use the whole land, then you can pay me for the land, or we can just divide it out, that you have this part and I have this part.
Right. And what would we call that last thing that you said, Brandon?
Is it partition in kind?
We could ask for a partition, right? So we can end the co-tenancy. So Macrith has is it a she?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. So Macrith has at her disposal the possibility of suing for partition here and ending the co-tenancy. And so, Brandon, why do you think that might not be happening in this instance?
Well, she initially wrote him a letter stating that she either wants half the rent or she wants him to vacate half the premise. And he ignored the letter. And then so she took that as like as an ouster of him preventing her from exercising her enjoyment of the land. So I think that she kind of took it as that
Right.
instead of a partition.
Right. So, but that's again getting into the sort of legal argument that she's making. My question is, why would she have come to court and asked for rent and not just said, I don't have to ask for rent. I can just split this property physically. I'm entitled to that, or I'm entitled to a partition by sale, and I'll get my share of the money. So I guess what I'm trying to figure out is, why do y'all think she did not sue for a partition in this case? We don't know the answer. I'm just, asking you guys to speculate.
I would guess that she just wasn't present in Tuscaloosa. Therefore, she didn't really want to deal with the property, and it'd be a lot easier for her to just collect rent than it would be to maintain the property and do something else with it.
But couldn't she collect rent from her half if it got split? So
Well, isn't it?
So why wouldn't that work?
Isn't it property that's in downtown Tuscaloosa? So I'm assuming that there was a building on it. So if she were to split the land, I don't see how they would. I guess they could split the building and have two other, leases take the building, but it just seems like a big burden on her to do all that just to get half the rent.
Forget whether it's a burden on her. I think you've hit on the key point here, which is that the building is probably more valuable as a single building than as a building that's split in half, right? And so if that's the case, then partition might be possible, and maybe she would want a partition by sale in which the property was sold and she got her cash and then she could do whatever she wanted with it. But a partition in kind here might not serve her purposes because it might devalue the rent that she might be able to get. She wants AutoRite to come back, or somebody like AutoRite to come back and pay rent for the full property. And so maybe that's discouraging her from seeking a partition in this context. So that she sent these letters, right? And she said in the letters, vacate or pay me rent. And so her theory is, and I think, William, you sounded kind of sympathetic to her, that it can't be that you can just have a co-tenant use the entirety of the property and not compensate the other co-tenant. Okay? That's her theory. Is that right, William?
Yes, sir.
Okay. And so she sends the letters. And what does Spiller do with the letters in response?
Are you asking the whole group that's going today or someone in particular?
I'm asking William right now, but if needs be, then I will turn to the rest of the group.
I didn't think he responded. If I remember, like he just didn't care really.
Did Spiller pay rent?
No.
Did Spiller vacate?
I don't know. I don't believe so.
No. And in fact, if Spiller did anything, and I don't know that this was necessarily in response to the letters, Spiller locked the warehouse with locks. Does Macrith have keys to these locks?
Nope.
No. So that's what's going on. And so the court has to decide this question, which is Macrith right that she should be given rent for Spiller using, let's be honest, Spiller's own property? Okay. Macrith is saying the circumstances here are such that Spiller should have to pay rent for using Spiller's own property. Let me ask you, William, one quick question before we turn to that, which is, if Spiller wasn't using the property, would Spiller have to pay rent to Macrith?
No.
Certainly not, right? So we've got sort of two separate kinds of ways of thinking about this. One, Spiller certainly doesn't have to pay rent for using Spiller's own property if Spiller was the sole fee simple holder here. And also, if Spiller isn't using it, there's no like automatic they should have to pay anything to their co-tenants. So we're in this kind of in-between space where Spiller is using it and doesn't hold it solely in fee simple on their own. Okay, so this court deals with this issue. And William, if you could sketch out a little bit the way in which they think about the way in which the court is thinking about this. What is the sort of basic principle that that they're using here, the court?
Well, I know that they say that that they were unable to find any evidence that supports a legal conclusion of ouster, and they reversed the trial court's judgment that awarded McElrath the $2,100 rental.
Great. So the trial court said, yes, you do have to pay the rent, and the court here says, no, you do not. And you use that word ouster, and that's the key word in this case. So what does that mean?
I think ouster is, I guess trying to put it in my own words, it's just like denying a co-tenant the right to use their own property. Is that right? I'm a little off.
That's exactly your own words were good ones. It is the denial by one co-tenant of other co-tenants' ability to use the property. Okay, so in this case, Macrith was saying that Spiller was behaving in such a way that it foreclosed Macrith's ability to use the property. Okay, and therefore rent would be owed, right? So what is there's a factual question, which is what constitutes ouster, and then there's a legal effect. If someone is ousted, then if a co-tenant ousts another co-tenant, then the ousting co-tenant owes rent to the ousted co-tenant. So Nakota, let's talk a little bit about the factual question. The factual question is, did ouster occur? William has said that the court said no. And I guess my question is, why not? It seems like we've got locked doors and we've got these letters sent and we've got Spiller using the property in such a way that it seems like Macrith can't use the property. But why, how is that not ouster?
Macrith never tried to use the property. She never requested the keys. She didn't try to ever enter into the property or enter into the building.
But she sent the letters, right? She said, pay me rent. Is that not enough?
No, it's not enough.
So that's what the court says. Do you agree?
I personally do not, because I think that she should be, since she's not been able to get her investment from the property, that she should be entitled to payment.
So Nakota made a couple of quick points. One, the doors were locked, but Macrith never asked for the key. So there was no indication that the lock was what we would call exclusion. Okay. So Nakota, just real quick, if Macrith had shown up and said, hey, I'd like to get into our warehouse, Spiller, and Spiller, stood behind the locked door and said, haha, you can't come in and it's locked and I'll never give you the key, would that be ouster?
Yes.
Why?
Because she would not be permitted full enjoyment of her property.
Exactly. And so there we have a definitive rejection, a denial of Macrith's ability to use the property. Okay, but here the court says, well, she never really asked for the key. There's no evidence that there is that she's being physically barred or excluded from the property, and so the locks maybe don't do enough. And yeah, Macrith might not theoretically be able to use physically the property, but she hasn't tried. She hasn't tried to, move her own stuff in. So with this case, I'm often imagining that Spiller has got boxes like the third floor of my house that is just stuff and stuff and stuff and stuff. And he's filled up the entirety of the warehouse. And then Macrith has her own stuff. And she wants to bring her boxes in also and can't. Like there's not a square inch for her to put her boxes. But that isn't happening here. She hasn't even shown up with her boxes, right? And so what's left is these letters. And so Nakota, if you could remind us, what is the letter about?
That he either vacate half the building or pay half of the rental value.
Okay, and you think, it sounded like earlier you said, you think that was enough. If he didn't respond to that letter, that was sufficient to constitute ouster. Is that was your sort of personal opinion?
Yes, just my personal opinion.
Okay, so why? Why do you think that's enough here?
Because it's excluding her right to use the property as an investment.
Even though she hasn't tried to do so?
But maybe she is completely like a renter won't want to come in with somebody else using a majority of it.
Okay, so should she
find somebody?
So you're saying it could be that this is going to prevent her from being able to use her property, and since it could be, then that's enough. But the court goes the opposite way, right? They say the letters aren't enough. So if you could go against what your personal opinion is, why does the court say it's not enough? What did she really need to do in order to, quote, be ousted?
She needed to try to use the property.
And then what would have had to happen?
And then Spiller would have had to deny her access.
And if that happened, then we would have ouster, and then Spiller would owe rent, etc. Right?
Yes.
So could she have done that in a letter? Like
No.
her letter said, pay me rent or get out of there. And he didn't respond. Could she have written a better letter and gotten this done?
If she had requested the keys or something and he had ignored it, then I would think that would be enough to establish an ouster.
Okay, so maybe a different letter that was asking for something different. So she asked for the wrong thing here. And so that is what makes her lose, at least temporarily, this case. Brandon, what else do you think she could have done in the letter besides saying, give me the keys?
I don't really agree with the letter theory of that being enough at all. I think physical entry with being denied would have to constitute as an ouster.
That's the best case scenario, right? Showing up and being excluded. Think when you're thinking about ouster, you guys should be thinking about the right to exclude and the exclusion by one co-tenant of another co-tenant or all the other co-tenants. Okay, that's what constitutes ouster. When you're exercising a right to exclude that you really don't have. Spiller does not have the right to exclude Macrith. And therefore, if Spiller does, Spiller should have to pay Macrith for that, right? It's as though Spiller has taken away from Macrith the stick that she had, which was the right to joint full enjoyment. And you should, if you take someone's stick, you should have to compensate them for it. And so, Brandon, your position is it can't be done except by triggering what we would call an exclusion.
Yes, that's my stance on it.
So why? Why would you put the bar so high?
I don't know. I just feel like actually being denied physical presence of your property would be more of a showing of exclusion than just ignoring the letter. I mean, I don't know if there's evidence that he ever got the letter or, maybe he just never got around to writing back. I just don't think that it was just enough to prove an ouster.
Is Spiller doing anything wrong?
No, he's exercising his right of enjoyment to the land.
Right. So Brandon's position is, and I think that this, is correct in its, at least from Spiller's perspective. Why do I need to do anything when what I'm doing isn't a violation of anybody's rights? I have the right to use this warehouse. So I'm going to use the warehouse, right? Like it's as simple as that. Nakota, what could Macrith do the day after this case comes down? So she's lost. She's not getting rent for the time that Spiller has been in there.
She could
What could
move
she do
into
now?
the property.
Say it again.
You can move into the building.
And then what? And then what might happen? Let's say there's no space for her to move in. I guess what I'm asking is, as a factual matter, she loses here, right? It's not ouster. And so looking backwards, she's not going to get rent for the months that Spiller has already been in. But now she has knowledge about what she needs to do in order to get herself ousted, right?
Yes, sir.
She could write a better letter. So what could she do?
She could move a tenant into the building.
Yeah, she could show up, try to do something, right? Try to use it. And then if she gets excluded at that point, then what happens?
Then she was ousted and she could go back.
And then
She could go back.
and
to
then
court.
she would go in back and get rent. Exactly. Good. So what she could do after this is get herself ousted and go back to the court and seek rent. Dalton, do you think she should have to do that? Do you think that that's silly? Or do you agree with Brandon that, look, since Spiller's not doing anything wrong, until Spiller actually excludes Macrith, just not responding to a letter is not enough. You have to actually exclude. Do you think she should have to go through this whole, this whole process in order to get the rent?
So as annoying as that process seems, I do still agree with Brandon. And I think the court's reasoning was pretty plainly written. It said, that there can be no denial to the right to enter unless there is a demand or an attempt to enter. And I don't really think that the letters are a proper demand to enter, because like Brandon said, a letter could be, tossed away, it could be not delivered. There's a whole lot of things that could happen with a letter, and the wording of the letter could just be as such to where I don't think it could be sufficient. So I think there needs to be more there.
So this letter, it's clear that if she shows up physically and is kept from the property, that's going to be an ouster. Okay. It's also clear after this case that simply saying pay me rent or vacate is not enough. Okay, but Dalton, you said a demand and a refusal might constitute is what we need in order to constitute ouster. Okay. And so let's say that we have a more explicit demand, right? The letter that she sent said, pay me rent or move out, which are not really a demand for what she needs to demand, which is, I want to use the property. What if she had sent a letter that said, dear Spiller, I'm planning to use this property. I just want to let you know, I'll be there on November 15th, and please move your boxes. Would that have been a demand in a letter that would have been enough?
I think if she had actual plans to use the space. And I don't think that that demand is denied until November 15th when she shows up and he's still there. There's a lock on the door. So I think it's sort of, it's still, she has to show up and be denied.
Or what else might, if he responds to the letter, he might say what?
Now, if he had responded to that letter and said basically like, no, I'm not going to move out, like I'll see you in court, I think that then is a good denial.
Yeah, don't bother coming on November 15th. This is my space. I'll see you in court. That sounds like a denial, right? So the main thing to keep in mind is it can maybe be done via letter. Obviously, physical showing up and being excluded is our best evidence of ouster, but it could possibly be done in a letter as long as there has been a demand for access, and I think from this case, an affirmative refusal of that access. Okay, so that's two steps that we need in order for there to be an ouster: a demand and a refusal. Okay, and so it's a pretty high bar. William, I want to come back to you. Do you think that that's the right way to be? That it's this high of a bar in order to constitute ouster?
Yeah, I think so. And I think that kind of like Brandon was saying, I do agree with his point that how do you know that you won't be allowed into the building unless you actually go and you are denied? So I do agree with that standard, yeah.
Okay. And so, Nakota, I think you're on your own here on this group, but I'm curious, are there others out there who think that this bar is too high for ouster? Davis, you think, are you just saying, yes, I do, or do you want to add something in?
Yeah, I agree. I don't know if physical presence should be the standard, just because I think it would be a lot to ask to, like, let's say, for example, she is planning on bringing someone by to look at the building for rental purposes. It'd be a lot to ask to require someone to ruin a business opportunity just for the sake of having the ouster. I think there should be something before that, so you don't have to get that far into it. And I definitely understand the other side's argument, because that's a more like bright line, like clear cut way, but I think it's a little bit impractical.
Okay. Tommy, what do you think?
Co-tenants or one co-tenant to run in there and put down as much stuff as possible and change the land to exactly what they want before the other co-tenants can do anything about it. And then at that point, ouster's a difficult process, so they sort of get to enjoy the land more than their other co-tenants.
Okay. And so that would be an argument for maybe looser evidence for establishing ouster. Okay, Brandon?
I wouldn't even say that they're enjoying it more than the others, because they have a full right of enjoyment. And so I think she really jumped the gun by, suing him by just off a letter. If she would have wrote the letter and not got a response and then went to the property, she wouldn't even have had the suit unless he did ouster her. So I think that this whole process was a really unnecessary, because she could have just went there in the first place and exercised her rights.
Or at least attempted to. And I think that this is what's so important and so difficult conceptually with concurrent estates. Spiller did not do anything in this case that is beyond what Spiller had the right to do. Okay. And that's why the court comes to the conclusion that it does, that Spiller doesn't owe rent unless there is some, and I should make this point clear. If there is an agreement that a co-tenant in possession, like Spiller was, will pay rent to the co-tenant out or any co-tenants out of possession. If there is an agreement, then there's rent, right? It's whatever the agreement says. But in the absence of an agreement, Spiller isn't doing anything wrong. Yet, I think, the sort of pushback is that as a practical matter, Spiller is doing something that is, for lack of a better way of describing it, that might be described as constructive ouster. Like, for all intents and purposes, Spiller is excluding her. Okay, may not have made that official, but it is constructively she is ousted. And so why not recognize that reality? The court here says, because until there has been demand and refusal, then we don't know for sure how Spiller would respond. Okay, maybe to Brandon's point, Spiller should at least have the opportunity to respond to a demand before having to pay rent for doing something that he is at this point fully entitled to do. Jack, I see your hand.
Yes, sir. I was just curious if ousting always results in the person who did the ousting paying something to the other person.
What else might it result in?
Plot of land, one builds a pool, and the other one was curious, hey, do I have the right to go jump in that pool? And then he was curious, hey, does she have the right to say, no, you can't do that?
Mm-hmm.
And she had the house there and stuff like that. So she could technically say, hey, no, don't jump in my pool. This is like kind of on my area that we've been mowing. You've been mowing that side. So that would, in my opinion, count as an oust. But at the end of the day, he still has that right to full enjoyment of the whole property. So that's where I kind of am confused, because she has a right by her actions, and she's been living there for a while and stuff like that, to say no to him. But at the end of the day, he still has that full enjoyment right. I was just curious about something like that, for example.
So I don't think so. The technical answer to your question is, unless there's been some sort of agreement, then the pool is accessible to all co-tenants. So the answer is, it might not always result in payment, but it could always result in payment, if that's making sense. That is the effect of ouster. Ouster triggers by exercising a right to exclude someone who I don't have the right to exclude. Ouster triggers my obligation to pay rent. And so that is the effect of it. Now, whether that rent will in fact ever happen, right? They could come to some sort of agreement. Hey, you can use the pool, or something, some other sort of agreement. But that is the legal effect of ouster, is the beginning of owing rent to your co-tenants.
Wow. So you weren't kidding when you said that they literally have the right to walk in and take a bath in your bathroom, like that kind of thing. That's okay. That's interesting. Thank you.
Yeah. And it's probably not good, right? I mean, it's not a recipe for good relationships among co-tenants. That's why they often come to agreements, right? So most of the time, this is taken care of when they say, okay, I'll use this portion, you use that portion. This is my bathtub. Please don't come in. Davis.
Could ouster happen through like an agent of the person trying to get entry? Like, let's just say, okay.
Yes. So if Macrith, are you imagining a situation, Davis, where Macrith isn't physically in Tuscaloosa?
Yes.
And yes. And so the last point I want to hit on with this case, and it's not really relevant to this case, is another effect of ouster. So let's say Nakota, that what the court is demanding happens, and Macrith shows up and says, hey, I want to use this property, and Spiller stands at the locked gate and says, haha, you'll never get in here, etc. And then Macrith goes home. Okay. we've talked about that is ouster. And Jack asked the question, does that mean that rent is owed? And the answer is yeah, that is what it means. But what if Macrith doesn't do anything about it? What is another effect potentially of one co-tenant ousting other co-tenants?
It could turn into adverse possession, and Spiller could end up owning it in fee simple.
Great. And so what we have to have is a denial. So just like adverse possession is a taking of a right that you don't have, in that instance, possession, right? Adverse possession. Here it's the same thing. It's a denial of Macrith's ability to access the property that is open, actual, hostile, continue. It is all of those things. It's a little more complicated than straight adverse possession, because the truth is Spiller has the right to be there. So what we have to have is some sort of open denial of access for Macrith for a long enough period of time. And if that occurs, then it is possible that Macrith will lose their interest in this property through adverse possession. It's pretty unusual, but it is theoretically possible. And that is just something to keep in mind as an additional effect of ouster in a concurrent estate. Okay? Questions on this case? We good with ouster? Good with Spiller? So I just want to be clear, though there might be a temptation to recognize this idea of constructive ouster, Tennessee does not. Most jurisdictions do not. Most jurisdictions follow what we get out of Spiller, which is that in order to constitute ouster, we have to have an explicit attempt or demand for access that is explicitly denied. Okay, so it has to be explicit in both directions. I want to use from one co-tenant, you cannot use from another co-tenant. That is what it takes to constitute ouster. It can't just be like, oh, well, there's so many boxes that I can't get in, and so please give me the rent. Okay, that is not enough. Okay, we're good? All right, let's begin the Schwartzbaugh case as well. And push through here, and we'll not get through all of it today. We can at least set the table a little bit. So, Ryan, if you could begin us on this story with the Schwartzbaughs, and what happened and why we're again having an argument among co-tenants.
Yes, so we have a defendant, Schwartzbaugh, and a plaintiff, Schwartzbaugh, and their husband and wife. They are joint tenants with the right of survivorship of some land in Orange County. And
let me pause just real quick. The fact that they're husband and wife is completely irrelevant to this case, but it sure does make it interesting. So this case could occur with any co-tenants, right? It actually doesn't matter that they're joint tenants either. This case is not about the difference between a tenancy in common and a joint tenancy. So Ryan has given us that detail that it's a joint tenancy and that it's husband and wife. But the fact of their marriage makes this kind of, sort of soap opera-y, and that's great, but it's not, it doesn't matter. I just want to make sure that y'all hear that this case does not turn on the fact that Mr. and Mrs. Schwartzbaugh are related or married or anything like that. Okay. So we've got two Schwartzbaughs, and keep going.
So they have some land, and then in December 1933, the defendant Sampson started negotiations with both Schwartzbaughs for leasing of land. He wanted to do a boxing pavilion. Ms. Schwartzbaugh didn't want that. She objected, and Sampson knew that she would not join in on any lease to him. Okay. So then on January 5th, Mr. Schwartzbaugh did it anyway. He executed the lease for two plots of their 60 acres of land. And then Ms. Schwartzbaugh sued to cancel these leases. And
Okay.
February.
So let's stop for a second. If you had to summarize for me the interest that Mrs. Schwartzbaugh had in this property prior to the lease, how would you describe that?
In relation with her husband, she had half of whatever he had.
Well, no, if I said, let's say it was a conveyance, right? And I said to Mr. and Mrs. Schwartzbaugh as joint tenants. How would you describe what she had?
Half of fee simple.
One half fee simple in joint tenancy. And what else? So she has that. And then what else comes along with that?
If she breaks that, the joint tenancy breaks the right of survivorship. Is that what you mean?
Okay, so forget if she breaks it, but at the moment of conveyance, she had the right of survivorship. Okay, so she had the one half fee simple in joint tenancy. She had the right of survivorship. And what about use? What about usage rights? What did she have?
She has full extent of the use. Full right to
right to full enjoyment. Okay. So I want you to keep in mind that's what she has. Ryan, what about Mr. Schwartzbaugh? What did he have? Exactly the same thing. Okay. So she's got a bundle of sticks that includes the right of survivorship, the one half interest fee simple as a joint tenant, and the right to full enjoyment. And he has an identical bundle of sticks. Can you do whatever you want with the sticks that you have, Ryan?
As long as you don't infringe on the other sticks.
What do you mean the other sticks?
The other person who has fee simple, their sticks. So you
right.
can't.
Okay. Right. So other sticks related to the other interests in the same property. Okay. So could Mr. Schwartzbaugh have sold his bundle?
Yes.
What would the effect of that have been?
He would sell one half fee simple, but the joint tenancy part would go away. So it'd be a tenancy in common.
It would turn into a tenancy in common. So it would cancel the right of survivorship. What about the right to full enjoyment?
Both parties would still have the right to full enjoyment.
From a usage standpoint, a sale would not affect anything. Okay, they both could use it. All right. So I just want to make clear that, and I don't think that's terribly complicated, right? That's exactly really what he potentially is doing here. Okay. So I just want y'all to have that straight in your heads, that they have these bundles, and that as a general matter, you can do whatever you want with the bundle, subject to the limitation that Ryan just identified, which is so long as it doesn't negatively impact the other interest holders to the same property. Okay, so she sues, and Ryan, could you repeat real quick what she's asking to happen?
She wants to cancel the leases for the 2 plots of land.
She wants to cancel the leases for the 2 plots of land, and on what basis could she cancel? Is she saying that she should be able to cancel these leases?
She said that she feared that one of the leases runs for 5 years with an option for an additional 5, that she may lose her interest in the lease premises by prescription. Does that mean adverse possession or something else?
Yep. So she's worried about that, and the court says about that what?
Well, the trial court granted the motion for non-suit, so denied.
Well, let me back up. Forget what the court says. What do you think about that? If I lease something for 10 years, can I be an adverse possessor?
I feel like no.
Why?
Because you're leasing, you don't have ownership.
And what else do I not have? What do I have if I'm there on a lease that would get in the way of being an adverse possessor?
You don't have fee simple. You don't have a possessory stick.
Yeah, you do have a possessory stick, a temporary right of possession. Austin, what do I have if I'm a lessee?
You have permission from the owner.
Permission, right? Good. I have permission to be there, and so therefore I cannot be hostile, right? So what don't I have? I don't have hostility. So yes, Ryan, she's concerned about that, but that's really, even a first semester law student should know that's not a real concern. So why else should she be able to cancel the lease? What else does she think has happened here?
She's mad that her walnut trees were removed.
Great. She wants the walnut trees up. And what's going to happen to the walnut trees?
They're going to get torn down.
They're going to get torn down. What does that remind you of?
The law of waste.
Law of waste. Good. And so she is claiming that what is the effect of the lease?
It's wasteful.
It's wasteful, but what is, if we had to give a legal answer?
It's infringing on her right to full enjoyment.
Interfering with her rights. Okay. You said that you can do whatever you want with your sticks so long as it's not negatively impacting, or I think sometimes the word is prejudicing, the rights of other interest holders to the same property. She's saying that is what this lease is going to do. So she says, let's cancel the lease. Jaski, Sampson says, no, can't cancel this lease. Why?
So Sampson says that, well, the court talks about that basically he got every right as a leasee as would Mr. Schwartzbaugh would have as the original owner of Fee Simple in the joint tenancy. So, I mean, there's no infringement on her rights, and also that he's not like ousting her from the property to enjoy it.
And so he's saying, I only have what?
I only have what Mr. Schwartzbaugh had.
And could he cut down the walnut trees?
Yes.
Why? What is included in his bundle?
The same rights that she had.
Which includes
the right to enjoyment, or
right to full enjoyment, which includes the right to cut down the trees if that's what Mr. Schwartzbaugh wants to do. And so Sampson is saying, I can do whatever Mr. Schwartzbaugh could do. And she's saying, if you could, Jaski, can you clarify, does she think that that Sampson has sort of all the sticks from this lease? Is that her theory?
All of the sticks, meaning both her and her husband's sticks?
Yes.
Well, she kind of touches on that, being that she got injured, so she can't really go on the property, so she doesn't have possession, and that's also one of the reasons why she's kind of wary about the adverse possession. But yeah, she kind of feels that way, yes.
Yeah, so what we have here is a dispute about what the lease represents, and that's where we're going to pick up on Wednesday. Mrs. Schwartzbaugh is saying the lease represents essentially all of the stick going to Sampson. And Sampson is saying, no, the lease doesn't do that. The lease gives me Mr. Schwartzbaugh's sticks. And then from that dispute comes the conflict between them about what to do, whether or not this lease can be canceled and whether or not the walnut trees can be saved. So we'll pick up with that. And for Ryan and Austin and Jaski, I want you to be thinking about what, after this case, you would do if you were Mrs. Schwartzbaugh. Okay, that's sort of thinking through the next steps, just like we kind of did with Miss Mackreth. And we said, well, what could she do now that she's lost? If she really, what are her options? I want you to think through the same thing for Mrs. Schwartzbaugh after this case. Okay, So we'll pick up with that on Wednesday. And hopefully I'll see some of you at 2 just to hang out this afternoon. Okay? See you later. I can see you waving, even though I cannot see any of your faces. There we go. Thank you, Jasky.